Welcome to a new episode of Policy War. I am one of your hosts, Russell, and I give more of a progressive leaning view for this podcast. We have
I am Matthew. I am the delightful centrist with a libertarian slant.
And I am John. I offer the conservative perspective on this podcast.
And today we have an issue that is outside of domestic politics, which we have discussed for multiple episodes on the show, and going more into foreign policy. Very recently, it has been reported by the New York Times that the Iranian diplomatic officials have established informal talks with the U.S. through EU signatory countries such as Germany and France. These talks include attempts to reinitiate the 2015 Iran nuclear deal that Trump pulled out of in 2018. But there are some contentions being made on what the new deal will have. The United States does not want the deal to be a repeat of the 2015 deal, as Biden has stated that he wants missile silos to be restricted by Iran and also for Iran to reduce its military proxy wars through state sponsored terrorist activities. While Iran wants the deal initiated but wants the lift of sanctions first before they agree to any signing of a new nuclear deal. This has been a very hostile point for the region as U.S. Iranian relations have not been going well, especially since Trump assassinated the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, and they have increased even more fold as recently as this Monday. There are new reports that Iran's nuclear facility in Natanz was reportedly sabotaged by Israeli agents. These are reports coming from Iranian state officials, and this is not the first time that Iranian nuclear facilities have been sabotaged. In October, it began constructing a centrifuge production center at Natanz to replace the one that was destroyed months earlier in an attack that it blamed on Israel. And in November, in response to the assassination of a prominent nuclear scientist, it also attributed that assassination to Israel. And this kind of led Iran to passing a law that led to a substantial boost in uranium enrichment at Fordow, which is another nuclear facility. So there are high Israeli-Iranian tensions. Netanyahu has stated he will never let Iran have the ability to make a nuclear weapon, since Israel will no doubt be its number one target. Many U.S. officials believe that the 2015 nuclear deal on Iran should have been tougher and should have included things like Iran's backing of Hezbollah, but also there are many other things to consider, such as Saudi Arabia, who is a predominantly Sunni Muslim state, which also has high tensions against Iran, but is one of the United States' biggest allies in the Middle East. So a lot to discuss here, but just to lay out a little bit of what the former deal did. The deal's name is a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and it does three main things. The first thing is that it imposes nuclear restrictions on Iran. Iran agreed not to produce either the highly enriched uranium or plutonium that could be used in a nuclear weapon to a certain amount, and also took steps to ensure that its Fordow and Natanz facilities pursued only civilian work, including medical and industrial research. The deal limits the amount of stockpiled enriched uranium Iran can hold, and also allows inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency from the United Nations to watch over Iran nuclear facilities and make sure they are not secretly producing more uranium. So, with all this, should the U.S. renegotiate the 2015 Iran deal? And if they should they change its provisions at all? Matthew, you can go first.
Okay, so I would actually like to say that we should revise the Iran nuclear deal, and this is going to kind of dovetail in with two of the articles that I posted. One's from the Jerusalem Post, and the main takeaway from that is that we say up front in the deal that you can't refine past a certain percentage, which is around 3.68%, if I recall correctly, but it excluded things like spent scrap fuel plates, which have 20% purity. So that's kind of an obvious workaround that is not really covered by it. That seems like it needs to be negotiated into the deal, because you can have material that's like 6 times more enriched pretty quick. And the second article is one from Politico that points out that the United States is allowed to still sanction Iran like they did under the Trump era, as long as it's not regarding their nuclear deal. So if we're able to keep those sanctions going on, that kind of questions on whether we should include the things regarding terrorism in the area in the deal, or just get back into the deal and with a few restrictions on nuclear material, and then just file sanctions elsewhere on Iran for doing other things because it's already legal to begin with. So I guess on the benefit side of it, if we join the deal, we're at least in solidarity with the rest of the people involved in the joint plan of action. So I'd say we should get back into that deal renegotiated.
I certainly agree that we need to get back into a deal with Iran. I think fundamentally these problems, it is much preferable to solve them at the negotiating table. A military conflict with Iran would be a very expensive and very problematic event, not only for the region, but for the United States. And so I agree that we need to have a deal with Iran. Most of the criticism levied at the JCPOA has been that it doesn't go far enough. It's only for 15 years, or it allows them to still have some uranium, or any number of other criticisms. And I have the same criticism for something that my co host already pointed out. I think that if we are going to have a deal with Iran, it needs to be genuinely comprehensive. And so it needs to be, we address their nuclear program, we address the state sponsored terrorism and the Iranian backed militias that are all over the Middle East. We address the very stringent tensions with Israel they have at the moment. And so if we're going to, we should get back into a deal with Iran. And frankly, it's a problematic part of our political system that because the administration's changed, then we got out of the deal. We can't have a reputation as a country that we can go into an agreement with another country. 4 years later, we get a president from a different party, and suddenly we're out of the agreement. That causes us to lose all political reliability. And so what we need to do is we need to go back to the negotiating table with Iran, with all of our allies, and we need to create a genuinely comprehensive plan. Getting back into the JCPOA is going to have all of the same defects that it did when we first got into it. It doesn't go far enough, it doesn't address some issues, and it allows Iran, after 15 years, they're scot free again, and we're going to have to build another deal anyway. So I think this is the perfect time to go back to the negotiating table, create a genuinely comprehensive plan that addresses all these issues, and if we can properly address them, fantastic. Let's bring Iran into the fold of global countries. But that requires Iran to not be a rogue nation. So if Iran wants to interact on the international stage in the way that countries are expected to, great. If not, they get to keep their sanctions.
So I guess one problem I see with that viewpoint is it may be a bit harder to come up with a comprehensive plan that includes all of that put into one. It's like trying to pass an omnibus bill. You're trying to tackle so many things that you may have a hard time getting them to come to the table, considering we're already having a hard time getting them to come to the table in the first place. So it's kind of a tricky way to think about it. What's your thoughts on it, Russ?
So you guys made a lot of points. I also do not believe it's realistic for us to include everything that is warranted and for Iran to agree with it. We need to remember that the sanctions imposed when forced loss of over $100 billion to the Iranian economy, and the World Bank reports that the Iranian GDP is only around 453 as of 2019. So we have to realize, even with them facing those large repercussions, they were still really willing to violate the deal, because look at their neighbors. Their neighbors are Israel, who will invade them without a second thought if they have United States support. They have Saudi Arabia always looking down their throat, and who was also heavily based ally of the United States because of the mass oil exports Saudi Arabia gives to the United States. Saudi Arabia is Sunni. Iran is predominantly Shia. They obviously have vast disagreements on the succession of Muhammad, and this leads to hostilities amongst the different sects, similar to Catholicism and Protestantism, that is similar to medieval wars in Europe. So we need to realize that the entire Middle East is a war zone, and the United States needs to do whatever it can to de escalate those tensions. Now, while I do believe the United States should have never pulled out in the first place, because it doesn't really help anything, I need to talk about some points that Matthew made and that John made. First, with the political article that the U.S. is allowed to sanction Iran for things beyond the nuclear agreement, well, that ruins the whole purpose of the nuclear agreement. Yes, the U.S. can say, "Oh, Iran, you funded Hezbollah to be the largest military in Lebanon, and it's gone to war with Israel, our ally, multiple times. Maybe you should stop. We're going to impose sanctions on your oil." Okay, that ruins the whole purpose of the Iranian nuclear agreement. And even if they did violate the agreement, the U.S. can say it's for another reason and then have a way out of it, which is not how we should be enforcing this issue. It takes all credibility from the agreement itself. Secondly, with the fuel plates, I'm fine with that being included, but in all honesty, I would think that the nuclear science already realized that this had a lot of enriched uranium you could salvage from the product. So, I mean, in all honesty, I don't know if it's a loop around, because there's people way smarter than me with PhDs that obviously would have seen this, but if this is included in the deal, fine. Iran will still be a year or more so away from ever producing a nuclear weapon capable of launching. And we need to talk about the general thing that the JCPOA doesn't go far enough is pretty strong, because it does go pretty far. If Iran cannot ever make nuclear weapons, then it will never be the main power in the Middle East. Now, we can see the domino effect that happens if Iran does get nuclear weapons. If they get nuclear weapons, Israel will invade them before they can. Then Saudi Arabia will start wanting their own nuclear weapons, and boom, the nuclear. I was going to say the nuclear East. The Middle East is just nuclear waste in about 5 years once that starts happening. So we need to realize that we need to just go back to the 2015 agreement, which is more than good, and realize state-sponsored terrorism isn't enough for us to do this, because the United States, in all honesty, is the most famous state for state-sponsoring terrorism. We need to remember the Mujahideen. We need to remember we actually supported Osama bin Laden. We need to remember we funded the very same people that have bombed us for the past 2 decades. And we need to remember we're not much better than Iran when it comes to efforts of international morality. So that's all I have to say.
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Roussel on being able to use his anti-US concentration for his political science degree so well. Second, I just want to, I apologize. I know that may have sounded sassy, but I'm going to go ahead and do that anyway.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
So, I also want to talk about, so you mentioned it might not be terribly realistic to want to put all of these things like state-sponsored terrorism plus a nuclear deal plus things in the international stage all into one comprehensive plan. And I understand that. That's certainly going to be very politically difficult. I don't disagree with that. But I think, Roussel, you kind of pointed out why it's almost required that we do it all in one deal. Because if we try to do it piecemeal, the sanctions that remain after the first deal kind of lessen the impact. So realistically, let's say we have a particular body of sanctions on Iran right now, and that's rather debilitating, and they want to get out from under those. Well, in that case, then they need to change the way they act on the international stage, whether that be through international terrorism, whether that be through their nuclear program. And from those concessions, we will give them concessions by lifting those sanctions. If we try to do that piecemeal, then anytime they act badly in another area and we put sanctions back on them, then it gives the first deal less and less power. And so I believe the best way to go forward, because we have a carrot and a stick, we have good things we can do for them and bad things we can do to them. And realistically, the deal needs to be Iran will make some concessions. In return, we will not use our stick and give them some carrots. And that is best done in a single comprehensive deal. I'm not saying it'll be easy. I totally agree with you all. It's going to be very difficult. But I also think that's the best way to make use of the soft power that we have at the moment to try and create the most stable situation for the Middle East. That's also one of the quibbles I have with the original deal. It only lasts for 15 years. And so it's essentially just kicking the can down the road. And politically, 15 years just isn't terribly long. And I'm not sure we can really count on the situation in the Middle East getting better during that time. So it might be good to try and get our comprehensive plan now that will last a significantly longer time than making what is essentially a stopgap deal over a specific portion of Iran's activities.
I was going to add on there that I agree that we need to get back into the deal, but I disagree in the look at the deal. I believe the deal was originally put in play to allow them to have their nuclear program without using it for weaponry. And so, whenever you're trying to put this into a way and you're trying to mold their behavior, that seems like something that's kind of outside the reins of the deal and may complicate it even more. Kind of like I said before, if you want to bring them to the table and you want to make progress, you can't say, you've got to adopt this habit and this habit and this habit and this habit. And then, we'll lift all these sanctions and we'll agree on how we're going to do the punishment scheme. Whereas if you just go, hey, as long as you don't go nuclear, we can handle, the state-sponsored terrorism as much as we hate it. There's ways to get around that. It's not going to totally obliterate a country right now. It's not to that point. I mean, it's annoying and, it causes civilian deaths and things, which is tragic, but nuclear holocaust kind of takes priority over it. So by focusing on that, we're at least getting the main task at hand taken care of. And as we've seen with Israel targeting scientists and shutting down the facility you mentioned earlier, there's obviously this aggression where if that's not contained, it can boil over. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse that we've decided to exit the deal. And I guess that kind of may have relieved some pressure because we're applying extra sanctions, which could be legal anyway, and could, kind of halt Iran. But perhaps it'd be better in the long run for the community of nations, and especially our European allies, for us to rejoin a refined deal that would meet the U.S. and Israel's interests.
So, John's still sticking to the comprehensive point. I do want to say, while that is ideal, this deal is not for a comprehensive restriction of Iran's ability to spread its nation state influence. If we want to stop Iran from basically interfering in Syria, stop them from interfering in Lebanon with Hezbollah, and stop them from having state-backed militias all over the Middle East, they're just not going to agree with that. And it's unrealistic to think that they are, because that is most of their influence in the Middle East is through militias. So I don't think that that's ever going to get signed, which is why I don't think we should ever push for it. It's like saying the United States should get rid of half of its military bases in response to higher powers not wanting them to produce nuclear weapons. It's just not going to happen. It's not feasible. And I would hope we could be more feasible, because I'm the cynical political science major, which John did mention. And once you study U.S. history, it is very easy to find out all the ways the U.S. ignores treaties, establishes imperialism, and doesn't give a flying about other nations. So let's stop acting like we're the moral actor here. We're not. Just look into it, okay? And I really agree with Matthew that this deal was meant to stop a nuclear winter from occurring. That's the main thing. That's why nuclear proliferation was so prevalent in the Cold War and it's prevalent now. It's we're getting sidetracked by all these other issues. In all honesty, state-sponsored terrorism is not going to destroy the world. Al-Qaeda never destroyed the world, even though Americans felt like they did in 9/11. It's not going to be in the world. Nuclear weapons could very well be the end of the world, which is why we shouldn't sidetrack ourselves with other issues. But I want to bring ourselves to the other actors in the Middle East. And I want to bring ourselves to the two main allies we have in the Middle East, which is Israel and Saudi Arabia. Israel taking preemptive military action against suspected nuclear facilities in Iran. They've also done so in Syria. And this could be in payback for the wars that Israel has lost in Lebanon, but it also could just be a test to see how much the U.S. is willing to support it if Israel does get in a war with, say, Iran. Should the United States support Israel if it does get in a war in Iran, and why so?
I would say that we would have to see the progression of that. We should be looking to prevent that in the first place because we don't want war to break out. But in the event that that happens, we want to make sure it's in limited scope. I mean, if you look at Israel's history, they haven't really had too many imperial ambitions. About the worst they've done is they've taken the Sinai Peninsula. That's, of course, disregarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. I'm not going to weigh in on that. But what I'm saying is it's not like they've gone and, taken over Egypt and installed the new government there and taken over Jordan and Syria. They've mainly been taking the Sinai Peninsula, and then it was negotiated and they gave it back. So while they have internal conflicts, most of the things they've been doing abroad have been defensive or to cut off possible strikes against themselves. So we should try to de-escalate the best we can through the deal and through open channels. But if push comes to shove and they're going to use covert channels, like assassinating these scientists, doing blackouts, Stuxnet, stuff like that, then I mean, we should help them to the extent that we're not being too evil of a figure. I mean, to the point where we're not committing mass atrocities or doing things overtly. So that could be helping them with intelligence, maybe giving them supplies, but not getting our hands dirty ourselves.
When it comes to an actual war involving Israel, I agree with Matthew where we're gonna kind of have to wait and see. If that does materialize, well, it will depend on the situation, how much support they receive from us. If they are attacked out of the blue by several nations in the region, of course we help them. We should absolutely be assisting them in terms of defense. And I believe that's what our relationship should be defined as, because we have to remember Israel is sitting in the middle of a giant pack of enemies. That's simply where they are, and that's been the reasoning behind why there is so much conflict in the region. And so I believe that the best way the United States should have relations with Israel is first and foremost the defense of the nation itself. We should assess them in defense from outside actors, and we should also be using them as a strategic ally in the region. Now, addressing something that people like to bring up, Israel does not have the best record of being a perfect goody two shoes country. No country does, but Israel isn't even in some of the top places. There have been some things that they have done that have been relatively problematic on the international stage. For those particular actions, fundamentally, it is a mean, nasty world out there, especially in that particular region when it comes to international relations. And sometimes we have to pick between imperfect options. And realistically, we need allies in the region, and I can't find a better ally to have than Israel. And so I think that, especially in the realm of defense and in using them as a strategic partner to try and avoid conflict, to try and stabilize the region, I think we need to continue our support for Israel, though we should be constantly reevaluating our relationship to ensure that both sides are getting the necessary return on investment for that particular relationship. If it becomes clear that, for whatever reason, Israel does not want to cooperate as a strategic partner, if we are not receiving X amount of benefit from Israel, we shouldn't be sending X amount of benefits to them. And so, like with every other nation, I think we should be constantly reevaluating where we are with them so that we can make sure that we have a solid two-way relationship rather than a one-sided one.
I think both your points are very valid. I love how neither of you just full throttled through your support towards Israel in this case, as many politicians seem to do in this day and age, and seem to think that Israel could do no wrong. Obviously, the story is much more complicated than that, and we're not going to get into Israel Palestinian relations, as obviously there's been claims that the Israeli military has killed many Palestinian children, but also you can say the same of the PLO versus Israel. It's not really about who has the more high ground in that fight. But I do want to start talking a little bit more about John's point on how the deal only lasts 13 and 15 years on based on uranium enrichment. Should the Western countries make sure that other undeveloped countries do not ever attain nuclear weapons? Do you want the deal to be permanent? How long do you want the deal to go on? What if Saudi Arabia, say, was having the ability to develop and attain nuclear weapons? Should we do the same thing upon them in every country in the Middle East?
Realistically, once the cat is out of the bag, there's not very much internationally that we can do. And so that just goes back to, with our relationship with Israel, we need close cooperation in that particular area to ensure that there isn't reckless utilization of any mass weapons. When it comes to the time frame for the deal, realistically, we would want something permanent, but we all understand that politics is ever changing. And so the best case scenario is if we put together a deal that doesn't have a sunset period, that doesn't have a this is going to end in 15 years. We just have an understanding this is what the deal is going to be. And if major changes happen, then we can potentially renegotiate. But there isn't a time when you're just automatically let out of the deal. And there are essentially provisions in there which allow us to readily meet the changing times, but it doesn't give a way out after X number of years where the deal can just go ahead and expire. I think that that's the best way to deal on the international stage.
My thought process whenever it comes to nuclear weapons is that it's like gun ownership. You want it in the least amount of hands possible, and you want the most responsible hands possible. So we know that nuclear weapons already exist, and that we're already in nuclear troubles with other countries, various arms races developing means to deliver them faster. But we can see that we don't want other third world countries developing these weapons because it increases tensions. There's been times where other developed/developing countries have gotten the ability to produce these weapons, but they've been talked down, namely Japan and South Africa. There's also been examples of countries building their own nuclear capacities and being on edge, basically at the brink of war, if you look at India and Pakistan. So I would say that we want to discourage nuclear weapons as much as possible.
Well, these were interesting points about the U.S.'s relationship in the Middle East, one of the most contentious areas in the world. And I agree that we do not need another nuclear warhead fired as long as humanity still exists on this planet, because the next time a nuclear warhead is fired onto another nation may be the last remnants of humanity on Earth. So we need to realize what is really important here, and we need to keep having these conversations, questioning our politicians' priorities and responsibilities in foreign nations. So thank you all. I hope you all learned something from this episode. This is Policy War, and we are signing out.